Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Peter Edgar Feliciano. Welcome to Conservatish episode 262. Check out the sweet threads. Wherever you're listening, make sure you subscribe, share, rate, and review, or you're racist. I love you all very much. And you can find me on Instagram at Peter_Feliciano, Feliciano. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have Dan Taxation Is Theft Behrman. Yay. Thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely.
Even though you're technically from LA, and I don't really like LA people, but you know,
I'm a refugee.
You're right. You're a refugee. What's the Mexican word for refugee?
Shit, I don't know. Do they have one?
Well, no. I think they just pass them up to us. That's they call it migra. Thank you so much, Dan, for coming on. I know we met a few weeks ago over at Pork Fest. And you gave a fucking great talk about how to not pay taxes. Not sure if I'll call it that because I don't know how mad the YouTubes get, but fuck them anyway. But yeah, I appreciate you coming on, sir. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So can you tell people where to find you, where to support you, where to find your stuff? I know you're working on a book that's probably not ready yet.
Yeah. So I guess I'm kind of all over the place, and part of that's intentional. But if you want to find out more about me personally, you can go to danforfreedom.com. That's where I'm running my campaign, Casual Stroll for President 2024. The homepage there is actually, it'll give you a pretty brief overview of myself and my shenanigans. But I run the Taxation Is Theft store, which is taxationstheft.info, where I teach people how to basically legally not pay taxes, income tax. What else? Blood of Tyrants, drinkbloodofTyrants.com. I've got this wine, which is amazing. We have an amazing Merlot. We're working on a Pinot Grigio that's going to be available in a couple of months, and we're working on an energy tea. So you can, dump it in the harbor when you're throw your cans along with your batteries in the harbor.
Right.
So that's an awesome for-profit project that I've got going on. I'm involved in a lot of stuff. So
you are.
Yeah.
You're a really busy motherfucker. Yeah. And I think, do you think that's the capitalist in you? Do you think that's the Los Angelite in you? Where you're spinning plates a lot?
I think it's the ADD in me.
Okay.
Honestly. Because I started out as a capitalist, but I do a lot of nonprofit projects. All the political activism is totally not profit. I work with Liberty Memes Foundation, which we basically raise money to buy wheelchair vans for people who need vans. Basically, there's a lot of people who are just kind of stuck in their house. They don't have any way to get, you don't think about it that much because you see people in wheelchairs every once in a while. But there are people who just can't leave their houses because once they get in the, some of them can't get out of their chairs, can't get into the van. So they need an actual van that's got a ramp and they can be really expensive. So, that's totally a charity thing. So, but it's liberty oriented. So, that's kind of how I ended up there.
Awesome. Now, speaking of how you ended up where you're doing, so you were born in LA, or where are you from?
Yeah, I was born in LA. I grew up in LA. Spent a lot of time in Inglewood and South Central.
Sweet. Buying illicit things.
I lived in LA. I moved every couple of years. As soon as I turned 18, I was out of the house and I was moving a different spot every 2 years. So I've lived everywhere from the Valley to I don't know, West LA. I've just kind of been a nomad. I've never really set my roots down. So I ended up moving to Texas. Finally got out of California when it was getting too hot over there. And I know everyone in Texas is more Californians, but I was more of a Texan. Once I got there, I was they're like, oh, you're one of us.
That's what I keep telling motherfuckers. I moved from the Bay. I grew up mostly in the Bay. I moved to New York right before the pandemic. And then I moved from New York to Austin back in July of last year. So I just passed a year mark in Austin. I'm telling motherfuckers, I'm like, I'm bringing reinforcements. Okay. I didn't like what I lived through in California and in New York. I know what I'm talking about. Like, this is not, they're too, whatchamacallit, they're too like, oh, don't Californicate our state. I'm like, yeah,
Right.
but we genuinely hate where we left. It wasn't just, oh, the money, and
Right.
now we get to do the same thing over
Well,
where somewhere else.
we're the exceptions, because there are a lot of Californians coming who want to, they want to bring the blue wave and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, really? I
Yeah.
haven't seen a lot of them motherfuckers.
It's there. And
Okay.
I think I have a feeling it's kind of underground. I see a lot of it on social media, and like, yeah, for what it's worth, like, who knows how big that actually is, but I've seen like some polling data, and I see like all kinds of campaigns like, yeah, let's flip Texas blue, and all kinds of, yeah, it's hopefully it's nothing too serious to be concerned about. But I mean, and it's not like the red is that great either, but
No.
um
I think, you know what I think that might part of it be is that a lot of the California New Yorkers who are now in Texas might have post-traumatic stress disorder, because we weren't allowed, quote unquote. I mean, I was always outspoken about it, whatever, but we weren't allowed to think outside of the California box, the New York City box,
right.
while we were living in those places. And so now we've come to a new place. We feel that relief of like, okay, there's people with guns. That okay, everything, music is still relevant. It's not Oklahoma City. All right, cool. I can relax. But we're still a little resident to speak up about what we actually feel. But in my travels, I almost kind of feel like, as far as Austin goes anyway, it's kind of libertarian central. I know New Hampshire likes to keep that rep, but I don't know.
Yeah. And like, the further south you go to San Antonio, even McAllen, like, it gets very libertarian down there.
Oh, really? Okay.
But yeah, there's Texas is interesting, because I mean, it's massive, but you go from places that are totally like, anything goes, to other places where it's like you've got the corrupt sheriff, good old boys that are like, if you're not in the family, you're getting robbed.
Yeah.
Like, it's pretty wild. It's a pretty diverse place.
Right. So you grew up in Los Angeles, all over Los Angeles.
Yeah.
When in your travels through life did you start realizing that the government is the enemy? How did that happen?
I would say I was probably still a kid or a teenager, my early teens, when I was trying to start a business, and my parents were telling me like, oh, you need to go get a business license, and you have to go register your name with the government. And I'm like, why do I have to do all this? Why is this all necessary? Like, what are they doing for me exactly?
Right.
And like, some of the stuff seemed like, pretty, okay, I'm going to register my name. Okay. That's like, putting it in the phone book or whatever. We used phone books back then. Like, okay, there's no real harm in that, but then I had to get a license, and a license to do what? Like, I'm not really doing anything special here. What type of license? And they couldn't even tell me, because they're like, like, well, what kind of business are you doing? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm just going to do some stuff, some websites. And like, this was, when the internet was just being born. They're like, well, we don't have a license for that. So, okay, but I need a license, but you don't have a license for that. And like, I started learning that it was like, and then you want me to pay taxes and like all this other stuff. And I'm like, wait a minute, like, what are you providing for me so that I have to do all this extra work? Like, all I want to do is build websites, do graphic design, that kind of stuff. And that's all I want to do. What are you doing for me that I'm collecting this extra money and giving it to you? This sounds like, the kid behind me at the lunch line that was like, hey, give me an extra buck.
Right.
So it was probably pretty early. And as I started getting in and like, started resisting a little bit, like, what happens if I don't? Like, that question comes up a lot. And the threats start getting bigger, the further along you go. What happens if I don't pay the taxes? What happens, and I guess the further I went, like, the more I realized, like, these guys are willing to escalate this stuff to the point of killing me. But ultimately, like, no matter how small the law, if you don't do it, they're going to give you a ticket. And then if you still refuse to comply, they're going to eventually say you need to go to jail. And if you still refuse to comply, they're going to end up killing you. That's the government in a nutshell. And once you come to that complete realization that it's like, okay, it doesn't sound like such a big deal. I just need to register my company name, or I just need to, like, get a license plate for my car. It's totally not a big deal. But then when you realize they're willing to kill you over it, it's like, wait a minute.
Right.
So yeah, it's been a really long learning experience, and seeing this, like, the government really just operates like the mafia, every single aspect of it. Like, I know there's like so much stuff that they do that a lot of people are like, oh yeah, but they do a little bit of good stuff here, and it's like they do just enough good so that they have the public support, but at the end of the day, like, it's mostly run by criminals. I mean,
Right.
the government doesn't have a mind of its own.
Mm-hmm.
Everything it does is done by the people who are running it. Who like, out of you and me and anybody watching this, who wants to be the person to tell people how to run their lives and what to do and micromanage everything? Nobody wants to do that except for criminals.
Except for
Power-hungry
criminals, power-hungry criminals, and people who are unhealed. I take a weird spiritual tack from a lot of. I mean, obviously, Porkfest is the exception. They're very hippy dippy and they got crystals and all that shit. But and I'm down with you girls. I understand. I'm there with you. But I also like to, talk about eating, ass and things like that. But just, it's a cultural shift. That's all. That's what conservatish is. But my experience has been like, I lived in New York City. I lived in San Francisco, and I watched like what, and I know from my personal experience, when I've been a bully in other parts of my life, because I feel like most of us have had the experience of being bullied and being the bully. It's been because I have some trauma shit that I'm trying to take out on other motherfuckers. It feels good to bully people. And if I could get not only a rubber stamp from the government, but also a cultural, I'm a hero for bullying people.
right?
I'm a hero
You're bullying the right people.
Right. I'm a hero for segregating 60% of Black New Yorkers because they were unvaccinated. I'm a hero for doing that, for segregating, for bullying, for ostracizing, for the canceling, for whatever. You can't pry that out of the mouth of a motherfucker who hasn't done some goddamn healing work. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
No, that's
yeah. No, that's
diatribe.
That's accurate.
Yeah. So you had that experience, and on this show, just like I'm sure a lot of the shows you go on, and a lot of the activism you do, you're preaching to the choir. But let's just, I had Carla Howell on my show. That episode's going to come out in the future, but before this one comes out. And we talked a lot about first setting up the diagnosis of the problem before we just jump headlong into the solution, and also before we talk about how viable and easy that solution would be to implement, or a lot easier anyway than we think. But let's first diagnose the problem. One of the things that I remember, you were on Elizabeth Duffy's show a couple months ago, and you talked about the income tax being, I think it was 1913, or was it 1917?
1913.
1913. And before then, who built the roads? You see that meme going around.
Right.
So how did the income tax come to be? And then if you could talk a little bit about the World War II anecdote, that was really interesting.
So it's kind of a long history. I think the first income tax started somewhere around the Civil War, and it went through various changes until about 1889. I'm remembering all the exact numbers sometimes is tough, but somewhere around 1889 there was a case. It was the Pollock case, and basically they said, no, this is a direct tax and it's not a portion, so it's unconstitutional, and so they ruled the income tax unconstitutional at that point. Then a few years later, in 1913, they passed the 16th Amendment, and the new income tax. Actually, before that, in 1909, there was a corporate income tax, which only applied to corporations, which, for it's still theft, but arguably the claim is, when you're operating as a corporation, you're asking the government for protection, and so you got to pay them for that privilege of that special protection. So, which you give up all kinds of other rights, like they get to see your books and limited free speech and all this other stuff too. But so 1913, they had a new income tax. 1916, there was a Bruchaber case where basically they were like, I mean, people were challenging it a lot. There were a few cases in the Supreme Court around that time, 1916, 1918, where basically the Supreme Court said a couple times, that what the 16th Amendment did is it did not reverse the unconstitutionalness of the original income tax. What it did was it said we are no longer to interpret an income tax as a tax on, as a direct tax on property, because the reason it was ruled unconstitutional, it was a tax on income, but income was like, it had to be like rent, or there's a metaphor of a tree. Like if you buy a tree and sell it for more, that's not income. Income is the apple. You can pluck it off the tree. You still have the tree, but you have this extra income. Okay. So that's what income was. And they said that to tax that income was basically taxing the property, because it's part of the property. And because it's a tax on property, it's a direct tax. So what the Brushaber case and these other cases said is basically that the 16th Amendment didn't give any new power to Congress. All it did was it prevented Congress from taking this tax out of the category that it actually belonged in, which was an excise tax, and moving it into a direct tax. So basically what that means is this is an excise tax, not a direct tax. A direct tax, as much as I still don't disagree with this, legally a direct tax is when the government's going to be like, everybody who owns property has to give us a little bit, and it has to, there's a calculation that it has to, like, if you got more people in one state, that state has to pay more. But that's not what this is. This is an excise tax. And in order to be an excise tax, that means that it has to be a tax on a privilege, which means if we're doing business, and the Supreme Court has ruled many times that is an inalienable right to our life. We're able to do business. We're able to carry out common occupations and earn a living, right? And they've also ruled in other cases that rights cannot be taxed. They cannot be converted into privileges, and they can't charge us for exercising rights. This stuff is all really well established. So if we have a right to do business and exchange money and all this other stuff, then how can they tax that as a privilege? Well, the only way they can tax that is if we're doing business with the government, right? So if I say, hey, I'm going to go get a job working for the post office, well, the terms and conditions of getting that job are going to be that, okay, you're going to be paying taxes to the federal government. And the only reason the post office has to is because the post office is part of the government, and they have to charge the tax for giving you the money. So this creates the privilege, the excise, that's the basis for this entire tax.
Let me frame it in another way. Let me just to clarify. Is that similar to why, a goddamn Hershey bar? I pay taxes on a Hershey bar. Is it because not the EPA, the FDA is involved? And so therefore, like, that gives them a foot in the door, or what is part of that?
So the tax you're going to be paying on that is the sales tax. And the sales tax is established at a state level. Sometimes it's granted as so the state creates the sales tax in their constitution. It has to authorize it in their constitution. And then usually what they'll do is they'll pass a sales tax at the state level, and then they'll say other things like cities and counties can create their own sales tax to go on top of it. So that's why, even within the state, you'll see varying taxes. But if you look at the language of this, and California is one of them. If you look this up in California for the sales tax, the tax is on the privilege of doing business in the state of California. So they're specifically saying it's on a privilege. Not every state says it's a privilege, but it's the same thing. It's the privilege of doing business. Now the question is, if you have a right to do something, if you have a right to own property and exchange the same property within the state of California, that doesn't make it a privilege.
Right.
And so there's a big question of, okay, where's that line drawn, right? Like where's that line? What is a privileged transaction that requires somebody to collect and pay the tax? And that's that's another deep conversation. But that's basically what it is. And you're right. There's like a million different taxes. I mean, you look at gasoline tax, right? Gasoline there's state taxes and there's federal taxes. The federal tax is it's considered an excise, right? It's a tax on the sale. And the way they make that, or alcohol too, with alcohol or gasoline, the way they call it an excise is they basically say it's illegal to sell alcohol or gasoline. It's illegal unless you buy the privilege from us. So you have to get a license and a permit from them. And because you're now operating under that privilege, the conditions of that privilege are that you have to also collect and pay a tax. So yeah, that's what this whole thing does. Now, whether or not it should be a right to own property and whether that property can be gasoline, like that sounds reasonable.
Right.
Can I exchange my property with you? That's all well established with the Supreme Court. But as soon as you do it in commerce or commercially, or where you have like a business set up with a sign and it's open to the public, everything changes. And that's something that I think has gone undisputed, and I think the government kind of has like a like that's where they have their monopoly, and that's where they, you know, I guess you could say they're the undefeated champion there. But I would say it's debatable, right, as to whether or not they can claim that monopoly, because they're still based on our rights. Even if you do something as, I mean, maybe if you're doing it as a corporation, it's different. But if I open a little shop and I'm not incorporated and I'm not asking the government for protection and I use private security and like all this other stuff, and I've heard of I think Dave Champion has some examples of that, where he's worked with people who set up a business, and then, you know, the fire department comes by and they're like, we want to inspect, and they're like, no, you can't come in here, this is a private business. And the fire department's just like, we just want to check your meters, and they're like, no, you can't. And it all had to do with, they didn't want to get a license, right? Because if they bought the license, then they had to let the fire department in, but they didn't have the license and they were operating without the license, and they tried to coerce them into getting the license, and they were like, no. And finally they got the city to back off. So there are instances of that, and maybe the line is drawn where the corporation is. I think a lot of people have a lot of different theories on it, but it's largely unchallenged and it's largely accepted by most of the public, which sucks, because if the entire public, like, it doesn't matter what the Second Amendment says. If the entire public says, yeah, we don't need guns anymore, they're gone. Like, that's it. Like, it really depends on, like, the Constitution is just a piece of paper. It depends on us to stand for our rights. And you know, the government's not gonna, the government doesn't even like to tell us what our rights are. Like, we have to stand for our rights. We have to tell them, we have to resist them. So,
similar to the mafia thing you were just talking about, like, you know, the government gets away with whatever they want, or takes the step because they'd rather ask for forgiveness instead of asking for permission. And then when we actually, a few months ago, I had Michael Cargill, who's owns Central Texas Gunworks here in Austin, and is suing the ATF for their bullshit pistol brace rule, and he's winning. And it's just like, wait a second, but they're a government agency in our minds, in the cultural whatever, you know, we just think that the government knows what they're doing. No. They intentionally overstep. And then if you don't check them, you know, then oh, okay, I guess I'm getting away with this now. Thanks. You know?
Yeah. There's been, I've read a lot of interesting articles on the whole background check process as being unconstitutional. And that the only reason that exists today is because the ATF came in and said, you guys have to do this. And everybody just said, okay, I guess we'll do it. And when you think about most of the gun stores, like, especially at that time, Walmart, like, what's that? Bass Pro. Yeah. Like, you have like big corporate change, they're all going to fall in line, right? So that makes up a good percentage of these gun shops. And, you know, and you also have to look at, you know, a lot of people have a lot to lose. That's always part of the equation, right? Do I have a lot to lose, or am I going to fight this? People with not a lot to lose, they're going to challenge the government every step of the way. A lot of other people, they're just going to say, you know what? There's activist groups out there. There's gun rights organizations, like there's the NRA. Maybe they'll stand up for my rights, and then just, you know, wait for it to happen, and it never happens. And you know, I think a lot of people get the feeling that some of those organizations exist just for the fact of making that, like, making everybody passive about it. Like, the NRA is not really doing anything to protect our gun rights, but if they can at least get everybody else to say, like, oh, well, the NRA will take care of it, then it's like, okay, that means, like, you now have millions of people who aren't going to do anything about it because they think someone else is going to do it. Same thing with like ACLU or any of those guys.
Right. Michael Cargill, he's actually, the name of the suit is Cargill versus Merrick Garland. Like, it's him. Okay. You could support him. You could, you know, whatever, but he's doing it, you know?
Yeah.
Can I get a little clarification on what you talked about? A corporation gets protections from the government. What are the protections? Is it legal?
So let's say you have a corporation and you sell a product that harms a bunch of people, they can't sue you. They can sue your corporation. And so,
Okay.
oh shit, give me 1 second.
The power went out in Mexico.
For some reason, I updated the firmware on this camera, and now it shuts off every 30 minutes.
Oh, that's nice.
So corporations, right? You get this protection where, like, if you create a product and it harms somebody, they can't sue you. They can only sue the corporation because they did business with the corporation, not with you. And so the corporation doesn't exist. It's like it's just this they call it a legal fiction, or like an abstract thing, right? It's a concept. You can't point to anything and say that's the corporation. You can't even point to a building, because that building can be sold. And if it's sold, like, that's still not the corporation. So in order for if somebody wants to sue you, they can't. And that's only because the government won't allow them to. So if I wanted to take you to court, I'm going to take you to court and be like, hey, I'm going to sue Peter. And the court's going to be like, well, you can't, because Peter says you didn't do business with him. You did business with his corporation. And so therefore you can only sue his corporation. And there are ways around this. If, for example, if they call it piercing the corporate veil, where basically you have a bullshit operation and it's not really like, you're not doing everything to the T with the corporation. But in most cases, like, you can't sue the CEO of Coca-Cola unless you're a shareholder, because then you have a contractual obligation with him personally. But if you're just buying Coke and drinking it, you can't sue any of the employees personally. All you can sue is the corporation. And you can take whatever assets they have. So basically, that's all separate. You can't bankrupt the CEO if he's an evil person or whatever. You can't do that. Facebook, Twitter, any of those things, you can't.
Even if you can prove a higher malevolence, or
it has to be like actually criminal, like, not, and here's the problem with that stuff too, because when you're running into like multiple levels of that, it's like, so let's say there was no corporation and I have 1,000 employees underneath me. If one of those employees screw up, it doesn't matter if it was like they did something intentionally, or someone got the wrong instructions, or there's miscommunication. It doesn't matter. That all falls on me. But if there's a corporation, that all falls on the corporation.
Right.
So it doesn't necessarily have to be something intentionally bad, but if it is something intentionally bad and you have all those employees, then it's always really difficult to prove, right? Because somebody can be, and this is how the government works too, right? Look at the military. Go there and kill that guy, and those are your orders. And like, never asking, okay, who is this guy and does he deserve it? And that's how we end up killing civilians. I shouldn't say we. I hate saying we, but it's like bad habit, right? But they kill civilians. They didn't mean to kill civilians. They didn't want to kill civilians, but because they're denying this information and they're just passing along orders, that's how that stuff happens. And what did somebody know along the lines that person was a civilian, or can you ever prove that? So you have the same kind of thing whenever you have any kind of big organization. And so the corporate protection basically says, if you're running a corporation and you've already paid yourself, tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions, you could be a billionaire. You started absolutely broke with nothing, but you started this business. It's a corporation. You became a billionaire. The corporation's worth maybe even more. They can sue that corporation out of existence, and you'll get to keep your $1 billion. So yeah, that's the protection.
Right. So to get back on the track of the 1913. So in 1913, we had specifically, it was enacted the income tax on a new bracket on not just on individuals.
Right.
Right.
So
now, what was their justification for that?
So that was revenue. At that point, so here's the thing. I think I want to say the starting bracket was $100,000. Then, which in 1913 dollars is like, it's like $1 million now, right? So when they passed it, nobody was thinking that they're going to have to pay it, right? They're like, oh, this is just for like, billionaire corporations and everything like that. And that's what it started out to be, because they didn't have the infrastructure to like go. I think there was like 90 million, 100 million Americans at that time. they didn't have the infrastructure or the IRS agents to go around and collect all that money or do all the accounting or anything else. I don't know if people were educated enough to be able to like, I mean, people aren't educated enough to follow the tax code now, right? So, and how do you just like drop the system on everybody and say like, hey, 100 million people, something you've never done before, you're going to have to start doing taxes every year. Like, where does that come from? People didn't resist that. Like, that doesn't make any sense. But what happened was like, nobody was actually paying this tax in the beginning. And Bernie Sanders talks about like, yeah, at one point in history, our tax was up to 90%. Yeah, it was for the top bracket, but we're talking about like multi-million-dollar corporations, which today would be multi-billion-dollar corporations who were the only ones paying that much. And so, and that in itself is stupid because like, there's so many loopholes that like, I mean, anything the government proposes, like I can tell you exactly how to get around it. So for example, if they say, oh, if you make over $100 million, you're going to pay 90% tax. Okay, I'll split my company up into two separate corporations. One does half of it, the other does the other half. Now they both make under $100 million and nobody's paying the 90% tax on it. Like, it's idiotic, but like it makes great rhetoric and it makes people like get excited and want to vote for people because like, oh, this person's going to bail out the government. We're going to get free healthcare finally. But anyway, so nobody's paying this tax all the way until like 1930, 1940, 1940s when we got into World War II. They were like, oh, we need to raise some more money because we need to pay for all these bombs that we're building. And like that had nothing to do with like actually wanting to go to, and nobody was threatening the United States. This was not defensive. This was not immediate. It was like, hey, we want to get involved in this war and we need to, they were provoking Japan so that Japan would do Pearl Harbor so they could say like, oh, we have a reason to drop a bomb somewhere. Like the US was trying to get into this war that like they had no business being in. And then that's, and like people are like, yeah, but if they didn't, Hitler would have been running the world. Well, that's debatable because it sounds like Russia pretty much was the force that took down Germany. But I'm no historian on that degree. But that was the pitch that they gave the American people was if we don't all start paying this income tax, then we're all going to be speaking German. So what they did was they started payroll withholding in the middle of World War II. And that's when people started getting the money taken directly out of their paychecks. And that was going straight to the government and that was going straight to the war machine. So
when they enacted that, did they at least make believe that it was going to be temporary?
I don't think so. Okay. Because they were using the same tax that had already been around for about 30 years. Okay. Whether or not the withholding was going to be temporary, I don't know. It's kind of hard to find some of this stuff, but some of it you can find some really interesting information on. So at the same time, they were trying to get people to pay even more by selling them these war bonds. Mm-hmm. And I was sitting with my wife one day and I was talking, she's Mexican, right? So she doesn't know like all the old shows I used to grow up watching. Mm-hmm. Nick at Night, right? Mr. Ed. So I'm telling her about Mr. Ed and I'm like, yeah, let me see if I can pull up an episode. So I pull up an episode. The first one that comes on is the I think it's Wilbur, the guy who owns Mr. Ed. He's like, yeah, I got this new, he's an architect. Why does he have this new job? It doesn't make any sense. I've got this new job. They want me to go and give a presentation on why people should buy US savings bonds. And like the whole episode is a sales pitch for US savings bonds. And I'm like, what the hell kind of propaganda is this? There's episodes of Donald Duck where he's listening to the radio and they're like, okay, people, we're at war. We have to do this. And the radio's hyping up. We have to do everything. Are you prepared to defend your country? And Donald Duck's like, yes, whatever it takes. And he's like, okay, we're going to have to pay income taxes. Like it was an insane amount of propaganda that was going on to like push all this stuff. And it was all focused behind that. And so whether or not it was intended to be temporary, I don't know, but they were getting people to do it. I mean, it's like the masks, right? Like, right. You know, first they told us, oh, just stay in your home for 2 weeks and that's going to be it, right? That was kind of pushed as temporary. But the masks, they weren't ever really telling us whether or not that was temporary or if it was going to go away. So they were just telling us we had to. So I think, you know, to some degree, you know, there might be some stuff out there saying it's temporary. There might be some stuff out there saying it's permanent, but that was the big push and people bought it. and they went for it. And yeah, they continue to do that. That's why we're doing the payroll withholding today. But the interesting thing is, if you look in the tax code and you like really pull it apart and see what it actually says, it's employees of the government or residents of Washington, D.C. who have to pay this tax and nobody else. So like we're not actually obligated to do it.
I've heard recently some friend of mine, New York Freedom Rally. Do you know New York Freedom Rally on Instagram?
No.
Are you on Instagram? But suffice it to say, he's been doing a lot of work with the de jure people in New York, and differentiating between, a citizen and, someone who is legally, liable and financially liable. And he said that I can't remember where he said it. Fuck, I'm butchering this story, but suffice it to say, he said, like, we're all legally residents of Washington, D.C. That is actually the people in the country are legally, just so that, and maybe it's connected to that shit.
Well, you are if you claim to be, because if you claim to be, the government's not going to challenge you on it because that means you're getting paid, right? Like if you walked into AT&T, you don't have AT&T service, right? You just walk into AT&T and say, I'm here to pay my bill. And they're like, you're not in the system. Well, it might just be like, okay, give me $100 and I'll just enter it in. Right. Like they'll take your money. I know AT&T probably won't because that's too bureaucratic. And they're like, we got to match it with a file. Right. But the federal government basically created a file for everybody. So when you go in there and say, I have to pay my taxes, I'm a person who's liable for taxes. They'll be like, okay, well, if you say so, give me your money.
And
that's how it works.
Recently, I remember I was at a conference in Bastrop, and John Bush was like, he was talking and he said, yeah, I didn't give my kids social security numbers. And I was just like, I didn't even know that was an option. Like, I was like, holy shit, like that's a really interesting idea to just not saddle my children with, like, they can make the decision later on if they want to, but like, to not even put them on the grid so that they're financially responsible for shit that, interesting thought.
And it's wild because so I didn't have any choice. I got one, or somebody got one for me and said it was mine. I don't really know if it was mine or not because I wasn't there to witness it. Right. But in my earlier years, I went to Nevada and I was going to try to get a driver's license in Nevada when I was still living in California. Cause I was like, okay, I was starting to figure things out. Right. As long as I have a California license and I live in California, then I got to pay all these tickets. But if it's an out-of-state license, at the time, they couldn't do anything, right? They couldn't suspend my license or anything. So I was like, I'm going to try that. And I went in there and I remember very specifically on the form, it said, you have to enter your social security number if you've been issued one. Also, if I haven't been issued one, I can just leave it blank. Now, I could have told them I haven't been issued one, and I really wouldn't be lying because I wasn't there when one was issued. So, for all I know, that's not really my social, but that's debatable. But instead, I pulled up a federal regulation that said you cannot deny me a privilege just because I refuse to provide my social security number and a driver's license. That's debatable whether or not driving is a privilege, but having a driver's license is a privilege. And you are denying me the privilege by telling me that I have to put a social security on this thing. And I showed it. I was being real nice to this woman who was working the desk, and she went to go ask her manager. And I had a printout of the regulation. She went, and man, her manager was like walking happy through the back of the office. And as soon as she said, like, yeah, this guy doesn't want to give us, he has this regulation here. She just went furious. She looked over at me, rolled her eyes, and just went into her office and slammed her door. I was like, wow, really? You're that pissed off about like asking a question? So it's really, really interesting to see, like, but this gets into like the realm of cognitive dissonance where people are just like, what do you mean? Like, go somewhere, and tell them you don't have a social security number, and take note of how people look at you, like whether you have one or not. Anybody listening, try it. Just tell somebody I don't have a social security number. You could be from another country. You could be born out in the woods in the middle of nowhere, in a farm, in a barn. There are a million reasons you might not have a social security number, but people will look at you like you're an alien species. Like, how could you not? That's impossible. You must be lying. Right. And it's like, why is that such a big thing? Because you literally can just, I mean, there's no law that says you have to get a social security number when you're born.
Interesting.
Or that you have to get one for your kids, or that you have to sign a birth certificate. I know
Okay.
people who have refused to sign that and just like walked out of the hospital like, nope, see you guys. I'm not signing shit.
Right. No, I mean, I've heard from multiple, even on a more frequent angle where, mothers and fathers make the decision to not vaccinate their kids, and they're almost threatened with, no, we're going to take your kid. And it's like, no, you're fucking not, and they've had to push and push, and then they just leave. They get off scot-free, but all that bark and there was no bite. They just expected the parents to bend to the bark. You know what I mean?
Well, here's what's interesting too, because I hear a lot of concern about CPS always taking kids from families, and they say they're taking the kids to protect them. They always end up going to like some pedophiles who are like taking care of these kids for a while. What's interesting is I've seen plenty of videos, and I mean it's the same way cops work. It's the same way the IRS works. It's the same way every aspect of government works. A CPS agent comes to some guy's house and he's like, I have to see your kid because I need to check on their welfare. And he says, you have to? And they're like, no, you don't. You have a warrant? And they're there with a police officer. They bring a big, scary police officer with a gun who's usually just looking bored off his ass. Like, I don't want to be here, right? But he's there for protection and to look scary and to intimidate this person. I have to see your kid. I have to see your kid. Do you have a warrant? Then you're not coming in my house. You're not seeing my kid. Fuck off. And eventually, like they just keep pushing. Like, no, I have to see your kid. They'll keep saying that over and over and over again. And I mean, these people have every right to just slam the door in their face and be like, you don't have a warrant. Get out of here. In one video, he even asked the cop, like, does he have any right to come in here if he doesn't have a warrant? And the cop's like, nope. So like, the cop was just like, I want to get out of here. But yeah, so this is how the entire process of the government works. But you also have to ask, like, how did the CPS get there in the first place? Right? Like, do they have a list of all these kids? Well, yeah. If you go and register them with the government schools, they know exactly where you are. Like they'll come to arrest you or your kids. I've seen them threaten to arrest parents for like, your kids aren't showing up in school for enough. We're going to arrest the parents. They do all this kinds of stuff. And it's like, the only reason they have the ability to do that is because you've registered them with the school. And in doing so, you've created a contract. You've established that you are exercising a privilege with the state and all this other nonsense. If you would homeschool them, if you would put them in a private school, which, I mean, some of the private schools are intertwined with the state a little bit, but if you homeschool for sure, like there's no chance that that's going to happen unless like a neighbor calls, and says like, oh, they're, abusing that kid or they're not sending him to school or something. But even at that point, they're still going to need a court order to get into your house. So, so there's a lot of layers to this, but yeah, it's this intimidation that they use. The FEC.
What's the FEC again?
The Federal Election Commission.
Okay.
So I registered for my Casual Stroll for president, and
well, you did it in 2020 too, right?
I did it in 2020, but then I also registered in 2024. And this time I filled out the form online. They asked for a bank account number, and I just put all zeros because it wouldn't let me submit it unless I put something in. So I put all zeros. And then at the end, when it asked for my signature, I just had to type in my name. So I put my name, Dan Taxation Is Theft Behrman, under duress. And I submitted this, right? Now they sent me a letter back saying we couldn't accept your submission, blah, 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 and with no reason, right? So I called them up and I'm like, what's going on here? They had to escalate it. Next thing you know, I'm talking to like the head accountant of the FEC, right? And I'm like, yeah, why was this rejected? And she's like, I don't know. And she's like going through her computer, she's reading it, she's reading their letter back to me. She's like, I'm not really sure, but it says here you signed under duress. And I was like, yeah. And she's like, did somebody force you to sign this? And I said, yeah, you did. Because you told me I would go to jail if I didn't have an election committee, which isn't a constitutionally requirement for running for president. And she was like, and she just kind of like didn't say anything. And then she kept going through, and she's like, also, you didn't put it in a bank account number. And I said, well, yeah, I don't have to give you a bank account number. She says, you have to give us a bank account number. And I was like, no, I don't have to. And she's like, you have to. And I'm like, is there a legal obligation? Is there some law you can point to that says I have to give you a bank account number? And she's like, well, I don't know, but you have to give us a bank account number. Like, what does that mean? What is she really saying? she's saying, I don't know if I have any legal authority to force you to give me a bank account number, but I can tell you over and over and over again that you have to. And if you don't do what I say, then I can threaten to not accept your thing. But eventually, I haven't heard anything back from them, and I'm on the list. So I think they realized that what they were doing they couldn't do, or that I knew that they couldn't do that to me. But so like, and my point is, like, as stupid as that story is, and like as silly as like what they were trying to get me to do, like, it's the same thing with the police. Can I search your car? They don't have a right to search your car. So they ask, can I search your car? You're not hiding anything, are you? And most people are just like, yeah, you can search my car, I guess. I don't have anything to hide. Well, that's how you get drugs planted on you.
You're right.
That's how you get charged for your friend dropping a bag of weed in your back seat like months ago that you never even found. Like, this is how people get screwed, because like, no, you just tell them, no, I'm not going to let you search my car.
Where along the line for you personally was, because I always feel like it's like some people are kind of built for it, right? And for a lot of different things. But also, I know, even though I, sorry, it's going to be egotistical, everybody, but if you've heard my music, and Mike, you obviously know it's true, I'm built for creation, right? But it still was a muscle I needed to work out. A lot of motherfuckers are intrinsically naturally talented who choose not to work that muscle and choose to work in HR for their whole lives, but they're incredible guitar players or incredible singers or whatever, but they only pull it out every once in a while. It's still a muscle. The muscle I'm asking about is the willingness to be a pain in the ass in a good way. Where did that, do you feel like that came natural? Do you have people like a great, father or uncle or whatever, who like taught you, like, here's how you can do that, who taught you self-sovereignty, who taught you it's okay, like, no, don't trust the cops, don't trust the governments? Where along the line, or was it just experience?
I think it was a lot of experience. I mean, like, I got some little things I picked up along the way. So my mom was actually one of the first paralegals in California. She was like the first year they passed that program. She was like, she says she was the first, but I'm like, okay, but there was probably like 10 people in the program at least, right? Were you the first? Yeah, so like I learned some stuff from her about just how to like work the legal system, and like, and like I think she kind of gave me a little bit of stubbornness about like, stand up for what's right. But at the same time, I think she was I don't think she would have taken things like to the level that I'm doing, but maybe that was at least a little bit of a kickstart. It's really hard to say. Like, I mean, I used to kind of always challenge things, like, like, I don't want to go to school. Like, are you really going to make me? And that kind of stuff. So maybe I had a little bit of it built in, but like, I don't think I was ever like, I'm going to go up against the government. Like, I was scared of that kind of stuff. Like, I was like, no, I'll comply. It's not really a big deal. That's kind of how I was when I was younger. So, yeah, I can't really say, but I think maybe just running into like a couple times where like it was really just like a complete like assault on myself from being illegally arrested for asking questions. Like,
okay, continue.
Yeah, I mean, so I was in this downtown part of Santa Monica where like, all the bars are and everything, everybody's drunk, and like, yeah, I had been drinking, but I wasn't like, wasted. But there was this cop that was hiding in the shadows, and so I just stopped asking, like, hey, what are you doing here? And he's like, oh, I'm just monitoring traffic. And I was like, I was trying to imply that like, well, do you think like if you wanted to make the city safer, you would pull forward and like turn your lights on so people could see you and slow down and not run red lights and stuff? And he didn't like that, because he was obviously trying to pick up girls and like actually catch people doing, turning without a blinker and give him a DUI. So like, so he didn't like that. So he ended up arresting me for that. They tried to charge me with a misdemeanor, public intoxication, which I went to defend on my own, because the public defender that they tried to give me was like, you should just plead guilty. And I'm like, what? Are you stupid? And so I just went to go fight it on my own, and everybody's like, oh, you're gonna lose. Like, the DA's threatening me, the public defender's threatening me. You're gonna lose. People try to do that all the time and they lose. But I won. They dismissed the case. And it's like when you get in situations like that and you realize like how screwed up everybody is. I started learning about the law. At one point, I wanted to do the catch me if you can, like pass, study and pass the bar exam. And so I was like legitimately learning the law. And then I realized that there are so many lawyers out there who don't even know the law. They just know like procedure and how to like do, and it's like, and they're out there charging, taking your money to like give you a stupid plea deal that you could get on your own. It's absolutely insane. And these people are the qualified professionals. So once I started seeing all this stuff, like, I don't know, I just started learning. I was like, I have to learn more. I have to take this to the next level because they're out here screwing all of us.
Right. No, and part of the reason I ask is because I like cultivating that in people, I've always kind of been a rebellious, as soon as a bunch of people all believe one thing, I'm like, and don't get me wrong, I've gotten got a couple of times, but I've worked that muscle of like, no, whatever anybody, and that includes motherfuckers on my side, or my side. I mean, that's why the show is called Conservatish, because I'm like, even a lot of conservatives or libertarians are fear mongering cunts too. Like, oh, look at this person who's did this thing. I've been noticing a lot of conservative accounts I follow and have since unfollowed are turning into World Star. You know what I mean? Like, look at this black person beating up a poor white person, or look at this, someone beat up a kid who said he had a, Trump shirt on. I'm like, that's not news, bro. Like, people beat people up all the fucking time. Like, why? Okay, unfollow. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is, I like cultivating that in people, and it looks on the surface, especially to the left and a lot of lefties, that, oh, you should just comply because these are the people we've all voted for, that blah, 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 blah. But I would rather be wrong. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, I would rather, because so often, what's something that they, obviously a lot of people have known it for a while, but in 2014, the CIA and what was it? The Endowment for Democracy spent $5 billion of our dollars, our tax dollars, to overthrow the democratically elected Ukrainian government, and then put in their own people. Victoria Nuland had already chosen who was going to take over after the coup, before the coup, and then have been spending, I think it's 113, as far as a month ago, $113 billion to Ukraine, funding countless fucking deaths. Okay, Ukraine isn't even being honest about how many people that are being killed. And yet it's under the guise of our government cares. And I'm like, and even Republicans, GOP cocksuckers are apparently supposed to be small government motherfuckers. Wrong, because they're interested in keeping their job. Right. And so all along the line, I'm like, nope. I don't want to be involved in this anymore. And so I like cultivating, this is doable. Sidestepping the government, culturally beating them up online, whatever. This is doable. This is a lot more doable. And one of the things I wanted to ask and have you talk about, and obviously you don't need to go into too much detail, but you did a wonderful talk about not paying taxes at PorcFest. Can you speak to a little bit about your travels through that and how that's been for you?
Yeah. Yes. So the first time I tried it, didn't go over too well.
Wait, the first time you didn't pay, or the first time you? Okay.
So the first year that I made a lot of money that was reported to the IRS that I tried not to pay. And the reason for that was the way I tried to fight it. I tried to learn from what there was online. Turns out there's a lot of like misinformation on there mixed in with the truth. But it didn't work out too well. Eventually, they were like, "Yeah, you still owe us." So they dipped into my bank account. They took some money out. I called them up and I was like, "Hey, what do you want me to do, guys? You want 50 grand? I don't have it." And it turns out there's a do not collect list. So they put me on that, and basically I just rode that out for the next, I think it was like maybe 7 years from that point, until I passed the statute of limitations and didn't have to pay them. So what they got was actually just a fraction of what, I would have paid if I, did everything according to what they wanted to do. But then, I continued to learn and really understand what's really going on here. And so, like maybe 5 years ago, I filed for that year and got all of the money back that was withheld from me. So they actually sent me a big fat check, including $250 in interest, which they then later 1099 me for, which was kind of funny.
We're going to tax you on the money that was already taxed.
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. So So, but fair enough. I earned interest from the government. That's a privileged excise. I'm sure that's legitimately one of the things that they can tax, but that's below the $12,000, $13,000 minimum deduction. So basically, I don't have to pay anything on it anyways. But so now, like, basically, like, I got no resistance from the IRS when I did it this way, now that I actually understood what was really going on here. And it's the same thing. Like, it's everything has to do with voluntary compliance. And you see this in all their propaganda, which, interestingly, somebody was asking me, like, yeah, but I live in Canada. Oh shit.
Oh, that damn
Sorry.
That damn camera. You said you lived in Canada?
No. So somebody was interested in what I was talking about because they live in Canada and they were paying an income tax. And I had heard some stuff about how, like, Canada basically has been copycatting what America does, because they have rights and all this kind of stuff out there. So they learn from, I mean, governments get together, right? What is the UN? They get together, they exchange, tricks of the trade, how to rob your people. And apparently, like, everything on their income tax website says voluntary compliance all over it, which is a very strange set of words, very unique, not used anywhere else in the world except for the IRS. So I think their whole system is kind of the same. Now they'll say, like, well, voluntary compliance doesn't mean that you don't have to pay the tax if you don't want to, and that's absolutely true. But what they do is they get people to voluntarily submit themselves to taxation. So if the money is not taxable, if they can get you to voluntarily comply and say this money is taxable, then you submit this information signed under oath, penalty of perjury, they're going to assume, okay, well, that money must be taxable. If you call them up and ask them, is that money taxable? They're going to say, well, is it income? Then it's taxable. What does income mean? You don't know that. You don't know the legal definition of income. So you're just going to say, yeah, I guess it is. And they're going to say, well, then it's taxable. And they didn't do anything wrong. You will almost never see anything from the IRS that's signed under penalty of perjury. Like, when they say you owe this much money, that's not signed under penalty of perjury. They're basing that off of all the information that other people turned in about you, saying, yeah, I gave that guy money under penalty of perjury.
So say my company, just to clarify, say that I start working for a job, and at the beginning of the job, I signed I think it's W-2. Then they're now informed, the IRS is now informed that money that I make is taxable. At the end of the year, they send that in and say, this is taxable.
Yep.
So now I'm on the hook.
Exactly. Well, and they're withholding you'll sign the W-4. They'll send you a W-2 at the end of the year telling you how much they withheld. But yeah, they're going to send all this money to the IRS saying that you were an employee, which is a very specific term, and that your income was taxable. And they're going to give this to the IRS. Now, what you can do is you can go to the IRS and say, that guy's a liar, give me all my money back, and they'll give you your money back. It's
even if I signed a W-4?
Well, they could technically use that against you, but you could sign it under duress or something like that. The IRS returns stuff if you sign it under duress, but the W-4 doesn't go to the IRS. The W-4 goes to the company, and that's it.
Oh,
so
very interesting.
So yeah, there's different things. There's different things you can do. It's always a tricky situation, right? Because basically, you're being asked to lie on that form, whether or not you're a U.S. person. Which has a very specific meaning. And so you're being asked to, like, sign under penalty of perjury, which means if you're lying, you can go to prison, that you're a US person. And you're like, well, I mean, I live in the US, so I guess I am. Like, that's the mental process that people go through when they sign that, right? Like, I don't care, just give me the damn job. Like, I've never heard of anybody going to prison for signing a W-4, because they won't, right? But now you've got this guy who's like, okay, well, he filled out the form. Now I'm going to tell the IRS, and this is how they, like think about it. Whether it's a big company with HR, or it's a small business that uses an accounting firm, or they do things on their own, what do? They go to the IRS and say, what do I need to do? Oh, you have an employee, give them a W-4, make them fill it out. That's it. They don't know anything about tax law. They don't know about who's required, who's not required, any of this stuff. All they know is, I can't let you work here unless you fill out the form. Or if you do work here and you don't fill out the form, we have to start withholding money anyways and just send it to the IRS. And now it's not attached to a tax number, so you can't even get it back. So
right,
you're kind of, you're kind of screwed if you don't fill out the form because your employer is completely ignorant to the law.
And all along the line, all of us everywhere, including the people who work at the IRS, because you already shared that experience, even the people who work at the IRS don't know the tax law. They're just, well, of course, they gave you W-4, of course, then you're legally, even they. So all along the line, the whole system is either built on the bark, right? It's the threat, right? And then also our ignorance.
Yeah. I was on Clubhouse the other night, and somebody came in, and he's like, Clubhouse app, like anyways, this guy comes in, and he's like, yeah, it's interesting what you're talking about taxes. He's like, that's interesting. I'm a former IRS agent. I just retired a couple of years ago. And he's like, I think he was very polite, but he was like, yeah, it's all bullshit, right? Everybody has to pay taxes. So I was like, okay, well, let me ask you this. Who has to pay taxes? And he's like, everybody. And I'm like, okay. So everybody has to pay income tax to the IRS. And he's like, yeah, if they have income, they have to pay income tax to the IRS. And I was like, okay, so Vladimir Putin has to pay income tax to the IRS. And he was like, well, no, because, and then he started saying, like, sources within, that's, he's not a citizen, and I'm like, okay, but so wait a minute. Now you're just making up a bunch of stuff. Like, is that actually in the tax code? Does it say it exactly like that? Because you just told me a second ago that everybody has to pay income tax, and now you're making exceptions and changing the rules. So can you tell me exactly who has to pay and who does not have to pay? And he couldn't answer the question. And this guy had been working for the IRS, and he went in and he started telling all his stories. He's like, yeah, these big corporations, they would put their money offshore in these tax shelters, and we would go to those countries and dig up the records and investigate and like all this other stuff. And it's like, well, yeah, okay, and you got away with that because these people had no idea about what the law was either. But and they were also declaring that this was actually income, so it was taxable to begin with. This is how a lot of people end up in prison. Oh, well, if you're right, why do people go to jail for tax evasion? Because what they do is they say, well, yeah, this money is taxable, but I'm going to try to hide it from the government. And so now, like, the government is going to take your presumption that the money is taxable because these people aren't going to sit there and say it's not actually taxable. And they're going to be like, okay, so it's taxable, it's income. You called it income, so it's income. That means it's taxable. And you tried to hide it from us, so you're going to prison. They bring up Wesley Snipes. Wesley Snipes was not charged with, he was charged with tax evasion, but he wasn't like trying to say like, I'm not going to pay. He fell for some scam where like, and this is why I say beware of misinformation. Because like Wesley Snipes isn't stupid, and he fell for this scam. But it was one of these things where they're like, oh yeah, your birth certificate is on reserve at the Federal Reserve, and like if you write these bills of exchange to the IRS, then they'll send you money based on like all kinds of nonsense, some sovereign citizen bullshit. Anyways, like if you read the indictment, he was telling the IRS to pay him $10 million. Like that's how he filed his return. And he submitted that under penalty of perjury. That's why he was charged with tax evasion and all this other stuff. So like, but then how, when he was arrested, or, I don't, I think he spent a couple days in jail, but he was like on a film shoot in Africa when this whole thing was going down. And like, but the way the media presented this was he didn't want to pay taxes and he's going to jail. And then, oh, he's not going to jail, but he's paying twice as much as he would have paid. Like that was the whole story that the media was giving us on that. And it was totally nothing like that at all. Like he was like literally telling the government to give him like $10 or $20 million. So there's a pretty big gap.
Right. So essentially, because too often in the, and it makes sense. We've got frustration. We're angry, and we'll start wrapping up in a minute. We've got frustration and anger at being robbed from, right? Being robbed. But in order to do it, it's way more important to do it carefully and consciously rather than, well, I'm just not going to pay. Right. So it sounds like
that's how I tried it the first time. Yeah.
Right. Not just no. Right.
Right.
But it sounds like setting, and it's all legal, what you're talking about, setting it up so that you're not making yourself liable is the way to go. And there is a way to go it. And you talked about a couple of guys. I even mentioned some guy's got a Mexican name.
Payman Motejede.
Yeah.
Iranian, actually.
Okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah, he's out of Florida. But yeah, he's been doing this since the 90s. And this is the thing, right? Like there are a lot of websites out there with all kinds of information, and like I hear people come to me with stuff and I'm like, no, that's total bullshit. But like there was a big one about reparations in the 90s where like they had millions of people filing with the IRS that they didn't have to pay the income tax because of reparations and something like that. And so all of these, I mean, most of the people weren't charged, but like their claims were just completely rejected. But a lot of people fell for that, right? And luckily the IRS wasn't going to be an asshole and try to stick all those million people in prison, which they've done some stupid shit before. But what's interesting about that is that there's all this really bad information out there, and a lot of people who are promoting this are kind of like hiding behind the internet. Like you'll find websites with all kinds of information, and it's like, who's running this website? And they're hiding. They don't want to reveal their identity. And to me, that's really scary because, for one, like if you ever try to act on this information and you want to contact them, like especially like, you know, if you just reach out for help and they're like, yeah, sorry, I'm not going to help you, and it's normal for them not to help, but at least they'll like give advice, like, you know, yeah, the IRS can do this or that, but you know, one of the big things that even Joe Bannister, former IRS agent who hasn't paid taxes in 30 years, he was charged a dozen times by the IRS. The only one that actually stuck was he was helping somebody else out because somebody else screwed up, and then because he helped them, like he's also, you know, part of the problem. So people don't like to tell other people what to do, but they'll consult. And Joe actually does that now. He'll consult. He'll tell you like what you can do and what the IRS is going to do in response. But he won't actually tell you what to do. I think a lot of people kind of do that now, but make sure that like you find one of these people that their program is going to work for you. So like Paymon's program is totally like not filing, right? Which works great if you're all on 1099 because they're not withholding anything from you. But if they're withholding, then you want to get that money back. Sometimes that's a lot of money, and you know, it really help you out to have that back. So Paymon's program is not going to help for that. That's something like Pete Hendrickson, where and he's got a big following, and he helps a lot of people get their full returns back. So yeah, you want to find people who are out there helping, and who have the information, but they're also like not hiding behind it, because if they're hiding behind it, they're probably doing something wrong and they're worried about the IRS coming after them themselves.
Right. So we'll wrap up. A last question. Have you, because I remember you mentioning this a little bit at the talk at Porkfest, but I'm sure some of those people maybe have good intentions because they genuinely like they want to help, but they also don't want to put themselves in trouble.
Right.
Where have you come? Like, have you faced any extra bark or extra whatever from helping other people with this situation?
No. So one thing I do is I don't really help people. I get the information out there. Because I see that as one of the big problems. Also, like, I know I'm not the expert. Like, I mean, I've been doing this for like, I first started looking at this stuff probably 20 years ago, and like I still learn more stuff. Like, and I'm like, oh, something I thought was right a couple months ago is actually not exactly right. So I help to get the information out there. I always tell people, fact check me, look the stuff up for yourself, confirm it. And it's frustrating because I even have a friend who's a lawyer who was like, yeah, I was looking at one of your posts on Twitter, and he's like, I looked at the case and I looked at what you were saying, and he's like, that's not what the case was saying. And I was like, what was the case saying? And he was like, I don't want to argue with you. So he wouldn't tell me what he saw was the problem. And I'm like, I'm not trying to argue with you. If you saw something I didn't, I want to know. And he just kind of left it at that. So that was kind of concerning, because I was like, are you like really trying to tell me that I was wrong about something, or you just think this whole thing is nonsense, and like, you know, you don't want to risk your law degree and like all this other stuff. So it's kind of frustrating. I mean, it's the same thing. You ask your accountant, well, yeah, of course you have to pay taxes on it. Your accountant never went to law school. He doesn't like he learned the procedure. He was educated by the IRS. Like, of course, he's going to think everything, like, he doesn't know the history. He like, throw out the name Bruce Shaber and see if he knows about that. Throw out the name Pollock, see if he knows about that. Like, if he doesn't know any of these cases, he's never even looked into the history of the tax code to be able to tell you that, like, that he knows for sure. He's been told that everybody has to pay the tax, but he doesn't know for sure himself because he hasn't done the research.
Right. All right. Lots to chew on. Fantastic. Yeah. All right. All right. So everybody, obviously, this is all legal advice. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding, everybody.
Illegal advice.
Illegal advice. Now, I just have to say, I'm friends with a lot of anti-state motherfuckers on Instagram, and I'm making memes, blah, blah, blah. And some of it's hyperbolic and blah, blah, blah. Like you don't, and some people, they stay anonymous and they literally make memes about causing harm to certain types of people who may or may not work for the government. Sometimes I'm not that far necessarily, but I also don't feel like I'm martyring myself by putting my name out there and my voice out there and not being anonymous. I like doing what I'm doing, and I'm being conscious and I'm being careful about it, and I'm not saying something that I want to say. Like I'm saying everything I want to say, but I'd rather be open and honest. And again, I think it's that muscle, and you're a fighter in the culture war here, and you're giving people concrete, tangible experience, or like, here's the code, everybody, or here's that you're sharing information. Not only is that not something that's illegal, but it's also it's something that is legal, and it also is something that I don't think you need to be afraid of. I don't think we need to be afraid to put ourselves out there. And I'll just say that to my fans or friends or followers or whatever who are like, yeah, but I mean, so many motherfuckers. I just posted a meme about, or a talk about it today, where it's just like, they talk all kinds of shit about the government on the online, but are they learning how to make their own food? Are they like chopping wood and carrying water? Are they doing things to learn to live when the shit comes down? Because it always does. And I'm not saying be, doomsday, but I'm saying, like, are you doing concrete shit to walk the talk, or are you just bullshitting? And obviously Dan fucking Behrman is, so I appreciate that, sir.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So where can people find you online?
So you got my websites, danforfreedom.com. I'm on Twitter most of the time these days, at Dan for Texas. I'm on, I don't really do much on Instagram, but I'm on there. I think that's also at Dan for Texas. I don't touch Facebook because Zuckerberg's kicked me off too many times. But yeah, and Blood of Tyrants, that's kind of a mess. I think the Instagram is at Blood of Tyrants W, and I think the Twitter is also at Blood of Tyrants W, because they wouldn't allow us to have a long enough name to fit Blood of Tyrants wine in there. But also we're adding an energy drink, so we started changing stuff to Drink Blood of Tyrants. So that's drinkbloodoftyrants.com. Actually, go to drinkbloodoftyrants.com and scroll down to the bottom, and all of our social media stuff is there.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
awesome. Yeah, thank you for all that you do. Thank you for joining me today. Wherever you're listening, make sure you subscribe, share, rate, and review, and because it really helps the algorithm. I've been kicked off Instagram. I've been kicked off Instagram once. I've had stuff shadow banned and removed. They're threatening me every 5 seconds. So what I'm saying is, everybody, no, I'm not joining Threads. Suck it. Fucking Zuckerberg, piece of shit. Lizard motherfucker. But you can find me on Instagram at Peter_Feliciano anyway, and on Twitter at Rule62Peter. And yeah, thank you again, Dan, for joining me. I'll go ahead and end the recording.